move the motion.
Mr Efford, I beg to move that the House has considered the transparency of the Integrated Activity Fund. And can I say from the outset that it is a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to see members here this afternoon for a Thursday afternoon debate. Many MPs from different parties have attempted to question the government on this fund, only to be met with unclear and murky answers. And when we are considering a fund of up to £20 million each year to countries accused of human rights abuses, the last thing that the government should be is unclear and murky. Now, in terms of the transparency of the fund, there are several issues that I want to raise in the hope that the government is able to finally provide some answers. We know that the fund is spent across the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates and Oman. However, the government has failed to provide a breakdown of the spending in each country. And whilst ministers have reasoned with this lack of transparency by stating that, and I quote, "Many of the projects and programme activities were delivered regionally, so it is not possible to provide a breakdown by beneficiary state," unquote. It does seem clear to me that a solution for this would be to outline the projects that the IAF supports. Then we would be able to understand how the money is spent across the region. But when MPs have inquired into the projects that the fund supports, the government continues to be vague. And again, I quote, "The Integrated Activity Fund supported a range of non-ODA programmes and projects across the Gulf. These included, but were not limited to, activities focusing on culture, healthcare, youth engagement, economic diversification and institutional capacity building." But, Mr Efford, I'm afraid that this is not clear enough, and the House deserves to know exactly what projects the UK Government is funding across the region through the IAF. And I'd also like to highlight the fact that I'm very happy to give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman because he sets up the debate nicely here. But can I suggest to him that it might actually be helpful to go back to first principles and to ask ourselves whether in the areas that he has just outlined, the need for any reform within the GCC countries may not necessarily be rooted in lack of money.
The Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Orkney and Shetland, actually puts a very good point on the record, and it's something that I will attempt to develop later in my speech. But in terms of being first principles, he is perhaps right, and I'm sure that when he speaks this afternoon, he'll also reaffirm that to the Minister, the Honourable Gentleman from Braintree. Now, considering the accusations by human rights groups over the legitimacy of this fund, the government should be obliged to publish the results of the risk assessment that they should obviously have undertaken. But the government will not, Mr Efford, even disclose to the House either the beneficiaries or the implementers of projects funded by the IAF, giving ministers and the public no idea how their money is being spent. And members of this House and indeed the other House have repeatedly questioned the government on the specifics of the Integrated Activity Fund. However, we've only received vague half answers in response. And I guess it begs the question, if the government has nothing to hide, why won't it be completely transparent on the fund? Now, the issue of transparency clearly links to a topic brought up by members across the House, that of human rights abuses in the Gulf region. Members have brought up the fact that the UK Government funds projects in countries such as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, where we know that the death penalty, torture and political imprisonment takes place. Indeed, the human rights situation in these countries is actually worsening. Saudi Arabia executed a record 184 people last year, while the indiscriminate Saudi-led bombing of Yemen is responsible for what the UN describes as the world's worst man-made humanitarian catastrophe. And this is not the first time that the government has been criticised over its funding of projects in GCC states. Case in point is the controversial Conflict, Security and Stability Fund, the CSSF, which drew criticism from UK aid watchdogs for serious shortcomings in the way that it operates. It was found to have been insufficiently rigorous in applying safeguards to prevent the collaboration with foreign entities with suspect human rights records. A project that was funded by the CSSF was the contentious Security and Justice Programme in Bahrain. In its 2018 report, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee urged the government to review this programme, particularly in light of the evidence that Bahraini prison staff and security personnel had been implicated in torture and extrajudicial killings. Now, that programme, which cost at least £6.5 million, caused the CSSF to come under parliamentary investigation for its lack of transparency. However, once the programme began to face this scrutiny, it was simply transferred over to the Integrated Activity Fund. Now, if the CSSF faced severe criticism from this House for their funding of the programme, then, Mr Efford, it is only natural that the IAF, which is arguably more opaque, should receive the same investigation. The IAF has also come under further scrutiny for its links to the Bahrain Special Investigations Unit. Recent Freedom of Information requests obtained by the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy have revealed that in 2018, visits were made under the IAF from the College of Policing, IOPC, and Merseyside Professional Standards Department to meet counterparts at Bahrain's Special Investigations Unit. Since these visits, investigations by Bahrain's SIU have been criticised by the International Rehabilitation Council for torture victims as, and I quote, critically flawed, unquote, and failing to meet the minimum professional standards and minimum international legal standards. Bahrain judges and representatives from the Ministry of Interior visited the UK in 2018 and 2019 as well, also under the IAF. And according to the Bahrain Embassy in London, these visits were conducted to discuss, and again I quote, both the scope and implementation of alternative sentences in the UK. Now, these FOI requests also indicate that no overseas justice and security assessment was conducted for the judges' visits, violating the government's own human rights safeguarding policy. And prior to a mass prisoner release to ease the severe overcrowding of Bahrain's prisons following the outbreak of COVID-19, evidence suggests that alternative sentencing legislation was discriminating against political prisoners, including Sheikh Mirza al-Mahrous and human rights defender Ali al-Haji. Now, alongside revealing the other contentious programmes and activities that the IAF supports, these FOI requests further highlight that at least 2 programmes have been provided exclusively to Bahrain. This evidence shows that certain activities are, in fact, country-specific, thus negating the FCDO's claim that country-specific breakdowns are impossible, since activities are only delivered regionally. So in light of this, I would again urge the Government to provide a clear breakdown of the individual projects and programmes they fund in each of the countries that the IAF supports. But with a history of controversial projects and an insistence on being vague about the Integrated Activity Fund, this Government is not painting a particularly clear image of its support for the GCC region. Lord Scriven said of the IAF, and I quote, "I've never seen a situation where it started open and became more swiftly opaque as criticisms grew." He went on to say, "The Government has become hypersensitive, if not paranoid, to the fact that the truth will be exposed." So it is imperative that the Government is more transparent about the Integrated Activity Fund, including by releasing information on the specific projects that the fund supports, in what countries, and, crucially, if they comply with the human rights risk assessment. And so I look forward to the Minister, for whom I have the utmost respect as a personal friend. I look forward to him enlightening the Chamber this afternoon as he closes the debate on behalf of the Government.
The question is that the House has considered the transparency of Integrated Activity Fund. We have till around about 2:40 for backbench speeches before we bring the front bench in and Mr Linden to wind up. So do the maths, that's roughly about 9 minutes each, I think. So I call Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I say through you to the Minister that I think we need 3 things. One is a direct answer to why the Government won't provide the information which has been asked for over the years. Not just saying the spy clause or whatever else it may be, but why hasn't the information been made available the way it would be on virtually every other element of government spending, whether through the Cabinet Office, as this may be, or through the FCO, or through the British Council, or through Home Departments. Second thing is, I asked the Minister, how can MPs and the public judge the effectiveness of the programme if we don't know what the money is spent on? Because it seems to me that we can all produce a list of things which we would like the money to be spent on, whether in these fields or in others. And the third issue, which is the underlying one, which is the transparency of process. One of his predecessors, Alistair Burt, was very sympathetic and helpful as far as he could be when a minister, when I and others were working with the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy over some of the opposition activists whose experience with the Bahraini justice institutions was appalling. I've been in Parliament for some time. 2 periods have been under Labour governments. I would class myself as an opposition activist. There are times when I've been on the streets protesting about things, whether it's trying to help drug dealers by imprisoning the social workers or other kinds of things, the whole range of issues where I've challenged either our politics or our justice system. We have to believe in the rule of law, but the law isn't always justice. And campaigning to change the law or changing constitutions is something which ought to be allowed and actually encouraged. I take pride in being a country where I could stand outside number 10 Downing Street and shout abuse, or at least say to a Prime Minister, I think you ought to be a different person or a different party. That's part of opposition, and we find that without having the kinds of dictatorships which we had 400 years ago, without having the slaughter of political opponents, we've actually developed a better system, not perfect, but one that's more capable of improvement and more capable of recognising mistakes when they're made. My judgment on the limited information that's available in public is that the government has made a mistake in not being more transparent about this fund. I think we probably knew more about its predecessor fund than we do about this one. It's interesting that it hasn't always been spent. In fact, I think the average spending is only about 2/3 of the allocated £20 million a year. I look on this debate not just as the question of effectiveness and transparency and the other things I've talked about, but also as a way of introducing to those countries where it may be spent in cooperation on all kinds of things we're told, from institutional changes to aquaculture and the like, that we are actually interested in them trying to make fewer of the mistakes that we made in our past, and that they'll make fewer of the mistakes they're making in their present. If we're going to be effective collaborators, if we're able to put our weight of different kinds, whether military or diplomatic or economic, behind the states which are trying to resist some of the more powerful, worse elements in that region, and we do understand the difficulties they're facing, we'd like to know that public money and public process is working in a way that we can understand what's going on and we can support money being properly spent. That's why I think we need to have this transparency, greater transparency and greater effectiveness from the money.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here on your chairmanship for the first time. I hope it all goes well. This is perhaps something of a from both sides. This is something of a niche debate, some might think, and concerning, in terms of overall government spending, relatively small sums of public money. We've heard it's about £20 million a year for the last 5 years, although there were predecessor funds, and not all of that was spent. Having said that, you could buy a lot of free school meals in holiday time for the money that is going to what many will think is a rather prosperous region of the world. And I wonder, we haven't heard. I will pay tribute to the other sponsors of this debate, of Glasgow East and Worthing West. I exonerate certainly members of Worthing West for this, but I remember a lot of Conservative members complaining under the former DFID funding regime that money was being wasted by being sent to countries like India and China. But I wonder if we're going to hear the same about money being sent to Abu Dhabi and Saudi in the same way. And I think that in itself deserves some explanation. I'd like to thank the Bahrain Institute of Rights and Democracy, who've been mentioned, and also Reprieve, who've helped with briefings this debate, but more so because and what sometimes seems a thankless task, they and other human rights organisations labour constantly to bring abuses of human rights in Gulf countries to light. And really the crux of the issue here, I think has already been said, is to do with secrecy. And we were led to believe in one of the few statements that there has been in relation to this fund, because, of course, initially there was no admission of the fund at all. It was like security service used to be. It didn't exist. When it finally was introduced to the public, and the distinguished former Minister, Alistair Burt, described it as the IAF provides funding in support of a range of programmes across the Gulf region. These include, but are not limited to, activities focusing on aquaculture, sport and culture, healthcare and institutional capacity building. What could sound more benign than that? Aquaculture. That sounds a wonderful thing to spend British taxpayers' money on in Oman. But salmon fishing in Yemen. That, yes, indeed. Well, that's perhaps a rather sorer point. But that's not really the full extent of it, is it? With all due respect to Bert, who I've a great deal of time for, actually it emerges that about a third of the projects are what could be euphemistically again called justice projects, i.e. they are related to justice, security, imprisonment, issues of that kind. But we don't know, despite the plethora of FOIs, and the library briefing is almost entirely made up of questions with inadequate answers to them, some from the Minister who's here today, who I'm sure is going to refresh us with a far more candid response than that. We have a whole list of departments who are UK government departments who are spending this money, but we don't know how much each is spending or indeed on which projects. We don't know which of the Gulf countries are in receipt of the money and how much each of them is given. I noticed one reply to Noble Lord Scriven, which said all IAF-funded project work undergoes assessment and review. We're not able to disclose information related to particular IAF projects in greater detail, as we have a duty to maintain the confidence and confidentiality of our partners. They don't know, Mr. Efford, they don't want us to know what they're doing in the aquaculture field, it appears, at the time. I asked her, well, to draw attention to my own questions in the matter, but I asked a question just a couple of months ago, which drew attention to the contrast between the funding of, in this case, Bahrain in particular, through the IAF, with the two prisoners who'd undergone abuses through the Bahraini justice system and now are still waiting on death row, Mohammed Ramadan and Hussein Musa. And the reply, again, simply said, well, yes, we do object to the death penalty being used in these circumstances, but we are designing to support Bahraini-led reform in areas including human rights. Well, I'll go back to the question asked by the Honourable Member for Worthing West. How effective is that being? And I think the answer has to be not very, because the record on human rights across the board is getting worse year on year in countries like Saudi and in countries like Bahrain. Now, Saudi, being a much larger country and being much more proactive in the region, although UAE is becoming increasingly so, draws a lot of the attention. We've heard about the 184 executions, quite a number of them by crucifixion and other horrific practices. We know about those protesting for women's human rights who've been locked up and tortured, and all this happening now under the current regime in Saudi. But we also know that in Bahrain, they lifted their moratorium on the death penalty in 2017, have executed 6 people and have a further 26 on death row. And these are the headline figures, but actually if you look at the practices in prisons, the prison conditions which are squalid and lead to epidemic proportion outbreaks of illness, to the fact that prisoners do not get treatment for serious health conditions, and many of these individuals are long-standing human rights campaigners going back decades, and therefore are now quite elderly people. But they are locked up, and despite serious health conditions, they do not receive any health treatment. The situation in Bahrain has been going downhill since the Arab Spring, when there was a popular uprising that was suppressed using Saudi forces, and ever since then, not only the majority of the population, but anybody speaking out on human rights has been dealt with in a summary fashion. The civil liberties in these countries are virtually non-existent now. Whether the things that we would take for granted, things like a free press, the right to assemble, the right of opposition political parties to form, most of them have now been dissolved. Again, in Bahrain, unlicensed gatherings of over 5 people are illegal. Public protests are suppressed with violence. I have to ask the Minister, how's it going in terms of our attempts, funded by British taxpayers, to improve human rights in these countries? Because it all seems to be going in the opposite direction. There are many, I don't have time to go over the many individual cases, but cases like Ali al-Haji that's mentioned, Ali al-Wazir, Hassan Mushima, all those who are on death row, these are people who should be held up as supporting human rights and arguing for better conditions of life, who are suppressed by what are entirely oppressive regimes in these countries. Yes, of course.
It's a good idea if the Minister were able to say that some of this fund was used to help support human rights organisations in some of these countries.
Well, I'm very grateful. That's a very obvious point to make. I wish I thought of it. But now it's on the record, perhaps the Minister would like to respond to that. Yeah, it's why are we supporting? We've heard the organisations named, the Special Investigations Unit, the human rights bodies in Bahrain. They all have wonderful names, the Ombudsman. It's not just that these are ineffective, despite the money going from the UK. It's that actually what they do is they assist, they collaborate with the prosecuting authorities there. They prevent a sort of shield to proper investigation, and then often they turn down investigations on no or little evidence, which actually puts the individuals whose cases they are reviewing in a worse position than when they started. And these are exactly the organisations that we are supporting. I remember when I was Shadow Justice Minister, I mean the then Cabinet Office Minister, who was then the Lord Chancellor, we put him in very strong terms that we were selling. I mean, this is a peculiarity of our relationship with Gulf countries. Half the time we seem to be giving them money, and half the time we seem to be selling them services. We were selling prison services, what's called the Saudi prison contract, when in fact what was going on in those very prisons was torture and abuse and appalling conditions. And to his credit, he ended that contract that had been started by his predecessor, I don't remember for Effingham, Ewell, and that was exactly the right thing to do. Look at if mistakes have been made in the past, look at them again. How effective are they being? Are they in fact giving cover to oppressive regimes? Are they in fact making the situation worse? We cannot answer those questions because of the secrecy surrounding this and other funds. And it's simply outrageous that the government continues to use national security or other measures to disguise the use of money, which it says is for entirely benign purposes. So we would look for some answers from the Minister today. What we would actually like is a proper review of whether this is an appropriate use of taxpayers' money.
Thank you very much, Mr. Effingham. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I think I should perhaps first of all remind the Chamber of my register and the members' interests as I chair the all-party group for Qatar. I'm struggling to remember. I think I'm also an office bearer for the APPG for Kuwait. But other honourable members will know that the amount of commitment that these offices bring with them is, shall we say, variable. But my engagement with the APPG for Kuwait and Qatar has given me, I hope, a small measure of insight into engagement with Gulf countries, the GCC in particular, or what you might currently call the GCC, because I'm not sure that there is really a functioning GCC at the present. And I am not without sympathy for the purposes behind the idea of funds like this. I'm not, as I said to the honourable gentleman from Glasgow East, really persuaded that the deficiencies that you would have in civic government, human rights, even in aquaculture. Rarely does a debate come up where the MP for Orkney and Shetland can't talk about aquaculture. is necessarily down to lack of funding. But I'm also always aware that when one engages with countries that have deficiencies in these and other areas, it's best always to do it from a starting point of a measure of humility, and that you very rarely achieve much by lecturing and preaching people in other countries. Understand a bit of their own history and how they've come to the point where they are today. So to draw on my own experience with Qatar, for example, I have been genuinely impressed in recent years to see some of the progress that has been made in Qatar in relation to labour rights. You know, the abolition of the kafala system, the opening of an ILO office in Doha. These are significant achievements, and I think they should be praised. When I speak to people in the Qatari government, of course, we want to talk about these things, as they inevitably do. Every government always wants to talk about the things it's done where it's made progress. But you also have to be mindful of the fact that there are still a significant way to go in relation to LGBT rights, for example. And you know, to engage with any measure of integrity with these countries, I think you have to be able to tell them that while appreciating the progress they've made, you see those other areas that progress still has to be made. And I'm always very conscious of the fact that in Britain, the abolition of the death penalty and the legalisation of homosexuality are both things that have been done in the course of my life. You know, they both date back to the 1960s. So I think, yes, we should be engaging, yes, we should be encouraging, but that we should be mindful of the fact that we've not always had the greatest story to tell. On labour rights, for example, you know, let's not kid ourselves. We still have a problem with human trafficking in this country, even notwithstanding the gangmasters legislation that we've had now for about, I think, 10, 15 years. Humility is the order of the day. That said, however, engagement, I think, also must bring with it other things. And I think most important of these, as the Honourable Gentleman from Worthing said, should be transparency and accountability. And I think it is in the operation of the IEF that you find this worrying lack of both transparency and accountability. And it also, I fear, permeates other aspects of our engagement with GCC countries. So, while it's not necessarily directly on point in relation to the operation of the IEF, at least I suspect it is, who knows? I'm very concerned at the moment that the police chief of Dubai appears to be a front-runner for the presidency of Interpol. So that's Nasser Ahmed al-Raisi, a man who was in charge of a police service which detained a British academic, Matthew Hedges, for something in the region of 6 months on bluntly trumped-up charges for which he has always denied, and he was eventually, I understand, forced to sign a confession in Arabic, which he just didn't understand. And in that time, he was tortured. So, you know, the engagement with the United Arab Emirates in relation to that, for example, is not one which, in any way, shape or form, I think, can be seen as working in the interests of United Kingdom citizens. And it is because of the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability that the business of engagement with GCC countries does look from time to time as if it is operating on double standards. So we criticise China, and I'm 100% behind the government's new policy in relation to China. But at the same time, we seem to find it very difficult to to criticise the government in Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding, as the honourable gentleman from Hammersmith outlined, their truly appalling human rights record. Yes, they've recently legalised the opportunity for women to drive, but at the same time, they are jailing those who campaigned actually for that very right. The use of the death penalty, in relation to people who were minors at the point at which any crimes would have been committed, seems to continue on an almost unconstricted basis, including, God help us, crucifixions. So, you know, if money from UK taxpayers is being spent in these countries, then I think the government has a duty to account to the taxpayers for the money that is being spent, where it is being spent, and what it is being spent on. The little that we do know about the operation of the IEF, in particular as it relates to Bahrain, involves the sentencing reform in Bahrain and alternative sentencing. Now, that's a cause that I'm prepared to support and have. It's a drum which I have beaten for many years in this country. So yes, it's certainly something that I think we should be supporting. But if one considers the way in which alternative sentencing policy is pursued in Bahrain, you look and you find very quickly that, in fact, there is no benefit to the political prisoners in Bahrain. The beneficiaries of the alternative sentencing, are all within the criminal justice system. And I would have thought that one of the things that we would want to promote would be an equal treatment at the very least with political prisoners. We should, of course, be pursuing for not to have any political prisoners. But you know, if we are to look at those who find themselves imprisoned in Bahrain, then we should be saying that any advances should be equally available to all. So there is a case for doing the work that, or some of the work at least, that might be associated with the IEF, but I cannot think of many other areas of public expenditure, even of this scale, that are allowed to be maintained in such conditions of secrecy. So totally lacking transparency, totally lacking in accountability. And if the money genuinely is being spent on capacity building, then I think we would expect it to be spent through non-governmental organisations, which isn't easy in Gulf countries, I know that, but they are there and they do operate. And it would seem a more obvious route for channeling support. It's what we do in virtually every other theatre in which we spend overseas development monies. And, of course.
This fund is not part of our aid budget. It's overseas spending.
No, indeed, and that's why I deliberately didn't use the overseas aid term, or overseas development assistance. But I think to the hard-pressed British taxpayer, it's money that is being spent overseas. And if one considers that the objectives that are set for the IEF are ones that would not look out of place in our overseas development assistance budget, and if the objectives are to be the same, I think there would have to be some compelling reason why we were, on this occasion, giving money effectively to state actors rather to non-state actors. So I very much look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say in relation to this, although I fear it is a topic to which the House will continue to return for some time to come.
Thank you, Mr. Everett. It's a pleasure to speak in this, and I'm conscious that others have other places to go, so I'll not dwell on it too long. I thank the honourable gentleman for Glasgow East for setting the scene as he always does, and him and I agree on a great many things. We might agree on one big issue, a different opinion, but many other things we agree on, and that's important as well. And I'm always glad to see the Minister in his place as well. Can I thank I declare an interest as Chair of the APPG and Freedom of Religious Belief. I've long spoken in this House regarding the need to ensure that any funding received in conflict zones should be traceable to relieving the effects of conflict on innocent victims and not by those who carry out the conflict. And one example of this has been the funding to the, and I make no apology for this, to the Palestinian Authority, who carry out campaigns against Israeli women and children and who use educational propaganda to perpetrate the hatred between the two nations. As the UK hasn't published a full list of the projects that the IAF supports, it is clear if we directly fund textbooks. So, Minister, I would seek some clarification on that if it's possible today as well. It would be extremely useful. The British Government signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Palestinian Authority. The text is regurgitated each time it is signed, and yet paragraph 2.1 confirms that to receive our support, the Palestinians must adhere to non-violence. And if they don't, but it seems that the money seems to keep rolling in. My concern lies in the fact that the government had difficulty enforcing an agreement which sends tens of millions every year to people who endorse violence. What chance do we have of the government controlling and properly supervising the IAF, a budget a fraction of the size? I've argued that we need more transparency, and I'm very happy for this debate to take place today. No one should benefit from British aid that are not carrying out the most basic of obligations to human rights. One such issue has been raised to me lies in the issue of Bahrain, and other members have referred to it. Freedom of Information requests have demonstrated that the IAF funding has supported religious organisations in Bahrain, and the government has frequently praised Bahrain on their religious tolerance, stating, and they quoted from off their site, that Bahrain maintained a positive record on freedom of religion or belief. However, there's always an however, and however very clearly illustrates that that's not what's happening. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom has repeatedly raised concerns about systematic discrimination against Bahrain's indigenous Shia population by the Sunnis, Sunni government. Without full transparency of government funding to the Gulf, how can taxpayers be sure that public money has not been used to underpin bodies involved in religious discrimination and the violent suppression of civil societies in the GCC? This is why I believe we need the transparency and why this debate is so important. Government has often pointed at Bahrain's alternative sentencing legislation as an IAF success story. However, while an impressive number of individuals have been released on alternative sentences, and this should be noted and congratulated, I've been made aware that there may be evidence to suggest that racists may have discriminated against political prisoners. At Jai Prison, there are now reportedly entire cell blocks which exclusively house political prisoners, with those in criminal charges granted alternative sentences. A notable example of the discrimination relates to the prisoners known as the Bahrain 13. The leaders of Bahrain's political opposition jailed for their role in 2011's pro-democracy uprising. 4 of these men, Sheikh Mizar al-Marus, Mohammed Hassan Jawad, Mohammed Ali Rida Ismail and Sheikh Abdul Hadi Abdullah Hassan al-Bakhoder, have completed 9 years of their 15-year sentences, making them eligible for alternative sentences. However, despite their advanced age, some of them are over 70. All have been excluded from recent prisoner releases, while individuals convicted of violent criminal offences have been released ahead of them. When the International Activity Fund-backed legislation has been applied in such a discriminatory manner, without any transparency on how the IAF money was spent supporting this initiative, how can the public, how can the British taxpayer, how can we as elected representatives be confident that their taxes are promoting genuine reform in Bahrain and the wider GCC? Mohammed Ramad Had and Hussein Musa are Bahraini political prisoners who have been sentenced to death for their participation in pro-democracy protests and are at risk of imminent execution. The honourable gentleman for Hammersmith referred to him, and it's very clear that both Ramahan and Musa were tortured, sexually assaulted, forced to sign false confessions, and which acted as the basis of the capital convictions. As a matter of principle, the UK opposes the use of the death penalty in all circumstances, and I welcome that. However, the use of executions has risen in Bahrain by over a factor of 10 since 2017, in spite of the IAF assistance to strengthen the rule of law. The IAF beneficiary Special Investigations Unit. Sounds very dramatic and like they've lots of power. The fact is, the results of their so-called investigations are this investigation was criticised for being flawed, failing to comply with the Istanbul Protocol and leading directly to the reimposition of a death sentence. So a review and an investigation that led nowhere. Amnesty International has found the IAF beneficiary oversight bodies that are responsible for investigating allegations of torture and abuse continue to contribute to a pervasive culture of impunity in Bahrain through their failure to independently carry out their mandates. In light of these well-documented and very well-known failures, will the FCDO freeze funding until an independent review has been conducted? And Naji Fatil, a very prominent Bahraini human rights defender, is currently serving a combined sentence of 25 years and 6 months for his human rights activism. Things that we all in this House here subscribe to and speak about on numerous occasions. He has now been away from his 5 children for more than 7 years. When he was arrested, Naji was severely beaten, officers stomped on his head, and during interrogation, Naji was severely tortured, kicked, forced to stand for long hours, suspended from the seating for long amounts of time, and electrocuted very, very grievously in his genital area. His torture was so severe that he lost consciousness multiple times and had to be rushed to the hospital. There are public available pictures of resulting scars on his body, and he has suffered long-term consequences from this torture. Although Fatil now requires specific medication and surgeries for his various injuries, Jai prison authorities routinely do not provide him with such treatment and have cancelled surgical appointments numerous times. Again, are we helping these people financially through the International Activity Fund, and are they then disregarding, as they seem to, human rights? After Naji made complaints to the Human Rights Oversight Body, the National Institute for Human Rights, this merely reviewed his medical records and swiftly closed his case, concluding that he has rights related to access to health care without a proper investigation or any action to remedy Naji's situation. If the National Institute for Human Rights cannot do that job, or do it fairly, or do it impartially, or do it in a way that we can be satisfied, then it's time to do something about it. I conclude with this, Mr Robertson, and it's good to see you in the chair as well. Will government make its funding streams to the GCC transparent so that Naji and the British taxpayer can be sure money is not going to ineffective institutions that cover up abuse? These are just a few examples of why the so-called secret package of funding must be transparent. Let's see where it goes so we can make them accountable and allow for the scrutiny. And we must have dialogue with those we are helping to ensure that human rights protections are not just a talking point but are really a reality. Those examples is why we need that. Thank you.
Minutes at the end for Mr Linden to wind up. Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Robertson. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. And may I put on record that I am also chair of the APPG on democracy and human rights in the Gulf. And can I add my congratulations to my honourable friend from Glasgow East for securing this very important debate, and thank all members who have taken part in for their contributions this afternoon, and for the way that they have sought to get to the truth of exactly what this fund is, what it's being used for, and for shining a light in places where, frankly, this government and the recipients of this money would rather a light not be shone. And although this afternoon has been a useful exercise, it remains a matter of deep regret that in a democracy, such as a lack of transparency about how the shadowy integrated activity fund is being used, that the only way that we as members can scrutinise it is to have the occasional debate every couple of years. And I fear that, as always happens whenever the government are asked about this fund, that we're going to be fobbed off with the standard response that the IAF is being used for aquaculture, sport, culture, institutional capacity building and health care. And sadly, that's the old "there's nothing to see here" answer has been the hallmark of the government's response ever since this fund was established. And the honourable member for Hammersmith was absolutely spot on, that the government must think we button up the back if we are being asked to believe that sending money to the cash-rich states in the Gulf is to help develop aquaculture and sporting activities, but don't ask about it because it's a secret. We live in hope, however, that, and the government should be aware that even with the expected non-answers, are not going to deter us from continuing to ask these hugely important questions. Because, Mr Robertson, the secrecy and the lack of transparency which surrounds this fund makes a mockery of the government's claim to be pursuing an ethical foreign policy. An ethical foreign policy does not fund states who are complicit in human rights abuses and then seek to deny its elected representatives the right to scrutinise. How can it be remotely ethical to give money to regimes which are accused by many highly respected international human rights organisations of routinely using torture and of executing political dissidents? How can it be remotely ethical for a government to do everything it can to prevent the democratic scrutiny and avoid a public accountability for what has been done in their name? The Honourable Member for Strangford, as always, a great champion of the rights of people across the world to practice their religion or belief, is correct when he points out that we do not believe that there is a freedom of religion and the ability to practice one's belief, and we should not be funding states who practice those. And I'm sure in his response the Minister will say that the UK Government fully respects human rights, and he will condemn any form of torture and say that they are working to promote best practice among its allies. And that's absolutely fine. And there is no one who would disagree that they should be doing that. But as the Honourable Member for Glasgow East said in his opening remarks, the problem is, if they are as confident about their position, why do they run a mile from any form of serious scrutiny? Because avoiding scrutiny, it remains unclear that where this money goes and what it's been done. And it leads to the inevitable conclusion that this government has something to hide, and it knows that should that truth get out, it would have plenty to answer for that would not be covered under the aquaculture, sport, culture, institutional capacity building and healthcare defence. When he said, the Honourable Member for Worthing West, when he said that the Minister has to accept that hiding from public scrutiny is not a good look, and only leads to further suspicion. And the reason the UK keeps it out of the public eye is because they know that there would be outrage if the UK taxpayer discovered what their hard-earned cash was being spent on. And that's why, if there is nothing to fear, if there is nothing to hide, why this lack of scrutiny and transparency? And Maya Fo, the Director of Reprieve, when she said, the only way for the British public to be confident their money is not leading to abuses abroad is for the government to publish a full and transparent account of the projects we're funding and the human rights assessment that was done for each. There is nothing in that that I can see that a democratic government could argue with. Mr Robertson, despite all of the evidence in the human rights abuses that this money is going towards, the government continues to give its unconditional political and economic support to many Gulf states. And I think we should be asking more of our allies and our friends, but surely we have a moral and ethical obligation to reassess any current aid relationships we have with those states who stand accused of human rights violations. And I commend what the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland said when he called out the double standards that are at play here. When one considers that we treat other states quite rightly as pariah states for how they treat their political dissidents. And yet again, I fear that the United Kingdom stands accused of turning a blind eye to abuses when it believes it has something to gain. Mr Robertson, given the opportunity to dig into the workings of this fund are extremely limited, I will, in the time I have remaining, ask the Minister a series of questions. He may wish to answer them this afternoon, but I'm more than happy to receive a more considered written answer, so long as they do not contain the words aquaculture, sport, culture, healthcare and institutional capacity building. Firstly, will the Minister accept that the criticism of this fund is growing and it will not go away? And will he therefore explain why, if the UK Government is so confident that this fund only funds lawful, peaceful and legitimate activities, could he explain what they have to fear from an open and independent review into how it's being used? And why, at a time of this supposedly ethical foreign policy, and in the hope of restoring public confidence, will he not agree to suspend the fund while it undergoes that independent review? Why does the government believe that there should be no transparency or independent democratic scrutiny of the activities of those who benefit from these funds? In what way does this government believe that releasing the information about the activities of those receiving funding would threaten the relations we have with the GCC states? The government has claimed much credit for the human rights oversight bodies now operating in Bahrain, yet numerous human rights organisations have accused them of actually being complicit in the torture and other serious abuses. So will the government publish their internal evaluations and let members of this House and the public see how they assess the recipients of IAF money and how they are making progress towards building these effective and accountable institutions? The UN Committee Against Torture and the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy has revealed that these organisations have frequently failed to investigate and indeed have actively concealed and shared confidential correspondences with government bodies. They have been shown not only to be ineffective but are deeply compromised. Does the Minister not agree that these bodies provide the Bahraini government with a veneer of reform while achieving very little in the promotion of human rights? The government repeatedly claims that it benefits from an ongoing and genuine dialogue. If this is true, why has the government not been able to come out and condemn the death sentences against torture victims in Bahrain? And why those who are seeking funding from the IAF, why is that not contingent on those states who receive it not executing people, including their own dissidents? And how does he explain that two states in particular, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, who receive millions of pounds in taxpayers' money, how does he explain that they are executing more people now at a faster rate than they did before receiving money from the IAF? Will he accept, or will the government name all of the bodies which receive funding, as well as those who deliver the funding? Will the government provide a breakdown by country of its activities? And does the government believe that there is currently, and there has been in the past, no IAF programme that has failed to comply with the UK's human rights obligations? Finally, Mr Robertson, I wish to thank once again all of those members who have contributed today, and I put on record my gratitude and appreciation and respect for those human rights organisations and those committed activists who, on behalf of us all, are shining a light where too many people do not want a light to be shone.
Thank you, Mr Robertson, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I think it's worth making a point to start with, that there have been 6 contributors this afternoon to this important debate, and there's been a commonality amongst all the contributions. And I really think that it is something the government has to take note of. I also think it's worth reminding ourselves why we were told this fund was established in 2015. The then Middle East Minister indicated that, and I quote, "This fund is intended to support the delivery of flexible, cross-cutting and sustainable investment in the region. The IF provides funding in support of a range of programmes across the Gulf region. These include, but are not limited to, activities focusing on aquaculture, sporting culture, healthcare and institutional capacity building." That's what we were told. But I think it's pretty clear that the fund is used for a whole range of activities which go well beyond those limited areas that were specified. Now, a few months ago, I participated in a Zoom conference organised by the Bahraini government, and it was on their alternative sentencing programme in the country. And I have to say, there were many positive things stated, and there was no doubt about the distinct British influence had been on what was described to us. But I have to say, it was very limited, as we all know, because it only included certain kinds of prisoners. The other kinds of prisoners, political prisoners, which, as the member for Orkney and Shetland mentioned, shouldn't exist anyhow. are not included in such programmes. They are people who are unspoken of, unrecognised, but we all know, nevertheless, they are there. And I also think it's important to recognise that it's not simply parliamentarians who are complaining about a lack of information and transparency. It's objectively true that information is not even freely available to the whole range of non-governmental organisations, and certainly not to members of the public and anybody who wants to inquire about how the money is actually spent. Even the House of Commons Library, which we rely on for objective information, has been unable to find very much about the allocation of these resources. And I've read the House of Commons brief, which says very clearly that although the funding allocations are reported in the FCO's departmental estimates and its annual report and accounts, nevertheless, there's little else besides. They have been looking around everywhere for additional information and had to rely on parliamentary written replies from the FCO and other government departments to see if they can glean more information. But there's very little that they know about this fund. So I think this debate is incredibly important, and the response the Minister will make will be very important as well. And as we all know, in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain, as members have mentioned, there are a whole range of concerns about human rights abuse. And many people believe that the situation, far from getting better, is actually getting worse. It is therefore extremely important that we do focus acutely on how these resources are allocated and why, and whether or not they are being truly effective. Now, two of the organisations which have done a tremendous amount of work in this area are Reprieve and BIRD, the Bahraini Institute for Rights and Democracy. And it is significant that BIRD put forward a Freedom of Information request to the government in July 2019. And they asked a number of important questions, but one of the key questions they asked was, and I quote what is in their letter, whether any risk assessments were conducted by the government under the Overseas Security and Justice Assistance Guidance to evaluate the human rights implications of such assistance, and if so, what were the findings of these investigations? Do you know what the answer was from the FCO? And I quote them exactly. No OSJA risk assessments were carried out. Full stop. That's it. They didn't even bother to ask. They didn't bother to look. They didn't bother to inquire. They simply did not carry out their assessments. Not only is that wrong, but it's in stark contradiction to the expressed policy of the government itself. They are proud of these assessments, yet they don't bother to implement their own policy. And that's why I think, Mr. Chairman, this debate is very, very important too. And I also think that the debate must be continued beyond today. I do welcome the request that's been made from the member for Argyll and Bute, for example, to have responses after this event. And we will be looking very carefully at what those responses are from the government, because this is not a one-off debate. Our concern is deep, it is entrenched, it is widely held, and I do look forward to what the government have to say in response to the questions today and the questions which will inevitably be asked later as well. Could I say, to conclude, that I think it is absolutely central in a modern democracy where we have openness and accountability, and we have a clear statement by the government of how public money is being used, and if it is being used appropriately and effectively. It's not our money we're talking about. The people of this country have a right to know how their hard-earned resources are being spent by this government and whether it's being effective. So, Mr. Chairman, with those few remarks, I genuinely do look forward for a full response from the Minister, and I hope our debate will continue beyond this afternoon. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Robertson. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Worthing West, and the honourable members for Glasgow East and Hammersmith for securing this debate today. I'm also grateful to the contribution of other honourable members, and I will attempt to answer as many of the points as possible that have been raised. The UK continues to look at ways of deepening our already strong and historic relationships with Gulf partners. Our 2015 strategy sought to increase our mutual security, prosperity and regional stability interests. And in doing so, I reflect on the point that the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland makes about doing this with a degree of humility and the importance of also doing so with a degree of sensitivity. And he is right to highlight that the UK government seeks to work alongside and support and to encourage a positive direction of travel in the reforms in the GCC countries, but being a hectoring bystander is probably not the most effective way of doing so.
We weren't paying through the nose to also be that hectoring bystander when there is transparency and accountability. That's when you start being able to hector, surely.
Thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. I will address some of the points that he raised during the course of the speech. The creation of the Integrated Activity Fund in 2016 was part of the process to support that work to encourage and steer our friends in the GCC. Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland highlighted the fact that these are, for the most part, wealthy countries, and a number of members have questioned having any expenditure at all in this region. I would remind members that diplomacy is cost efficient, but it is not free. And if we want to make a positive difference, and if we want to be a force for good in the world and in the region, we must recognise that this has to be paid for. But it is completely understandable that members here and the British public would want that money to be spent ethically and effectively. And I would...
The Minister for giving way, and I don't disagree with anything. I understand that diplomacy costs money, but does he accept that when that money is being spent on behalf of British taxpayers, they also want transparency to follow that?
And I will touch upon the transparency of our expenditure in this region. I've recently come back from Oman earlier this week, and I saw firsthand some of the work that the fund has enabled us to deliver. And let me give you a couple of examples. It's helped provide technical assistance to key economic institutions in Oman to help them respond to the reduced oil revenues, to strengthen their regulatory process and their staff capabilities, because stronger economies underpin stability. And so this work creates a stronger business environment, which is beneficial, of course, to the people of Oman, but also is good for builds a better business environment for UK traders and investors. We also launched the UK Oman Digital Hub to raise Omani's digital skills in partnership with UK universities and industry, and it helps build innovative and more diverse economy in Oman. In February, we used the IAF to fund a trade mission to Saudi Arabia, which secured export contracts worth £80 million in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's smart cities sector. And our support for scientific and medical work on genomics in Qatar has established the UK as the partner of choice in this field. The honourable member for Stratford talked about the importance of tolerance, religious freedom, human rights and human rights defended. And he is absolutely right to do so. But it's through these partnerships that we are able to raise these incredibly important issues with our partners in the GCC. And this...
I want to recognise, if I can, the excellent work that the government does in yourself. But I give three examples. Three examples where human rights were being deliberately abused and disregarded. And surely that would indicate that the words that you're having with the people that you're having in government there are not being effective. If that's the case, then we need to find a different way to do it.
I understand the points you make, and I will attempt to address them through this speech. But as I was saying, the cooperation like this, to the benefit of both the people of the Gulf and the people here of the UK, is only possible because we are able to build strong and resilient partnerships with countries in the GCC. And of course, building this trust has to be balanced with the desire for transparency, which is a point that a number of honourable and right honourable members have made. I do need to take issue with one of the comments made by the honourable member for Argyll and Bute when he said that the only way to scrutinise the government's activity in this area is to have debates. And I might remind him, of course, that that is the way that governments are meant to be scrutinised. That is how Parliament works. And I am here at the dispatch box in order to be part of the scrutiny process of the government. I will give way, but I'm conscious that I do want to make progress.
His time. I think he knows the point I was making was that having this debate once every 18 months or every 2 years is simply not enough, and having written questions being fobbed off with almost identical answers time and time again is simply not. It's an inefficient and inadequate way in which to do business. That was the point I was making.
I understand. He will know that since becoming the Minister for this region, I am the responding Minister. And I must say that if he is critical of repetitive answers, it is because the same questions keep being asked. But I will try and address some of the points that were raised. As I say, I will attempt to do so promptly if members, honourable members, will permit. I'm conscious. I'm very conscious, and we've seen both here through written correspondence and more broadly that there has been criticism of the fund, particularly in our work in Bahrain. But our policy has been to engage with Bahrain and encourage and support Bahrain in its institutional reform through targeted assistance. For example, the IF fund has enabled British expertise to help develop Bahrain's independent human rights oversight bodies. And I know members here have been critical, but the creation of these bodies is important, and their improvement and reform is important. And the Ombudsman Office, and I know, again, it has been criticised, but it must be recognised that it has investigated more than 5,000 complaints. And had we not been involved, I invite honourable members to consider whether those investigations would otherwise have happened.
Minister says, for example, and he cites two examples that we've discussed already. That's good. But if he can tell us about these examples, why can we not be told about them all?
Thank you. I'm going to try and rattle through this because, unfortunately, I am going to run out of time otherwise. No, I mean, a number of the points that members have raised are embedded in this speech. But if I don't get to the end of it, I won't be able to cover them. The honourable member for Caerphilly has highlighted the alternative sentencing programme, and he said it is a welcome step in the right direction and would like to see it go further. And he is right. But if it weren't in existence at all, it wouldn't be able to go further. And it is in existence, at least in part, because of the technical assistance from the UK government. And these outcomes have strengthened human rights adherence and accountability in Bahrain, and they are only possible because... no, I'm going to make way, otherwise I will...
I thank Minister for his generosity. Look, the way forward could be very simple for government, and that is to provide simply a comprehensive list of all the projects which are funded. Will he or won't he do it?
Order, just before the Minister responds, I do want to leave 2 minutes for Mr Linden to wind up. Can I just remind everybody of that? Minister.
Mr Robertson, thank you. The UK is confident, and that it is evident that we are having a significant and positive impact on the human rights in the region because of the funds that we have allocated to the technical assistance. We conduct rigorous overseas security and justice assessments in support of this work. This preparation enables us to put safeguards in place that ensure our cooperation strengthens rather than undermines human rights and the rule of law. This fund has evolved and is now the Gulf Strategy Fund. Ministerial colleagues and myself will continue to use these funds to work with countries in the region to support our mutual prosperity and, as I say, strengthen their adherence to human rights. And we have reviewed and strengthened the governance of this fund, making the point that we do listen to concerns that are raised by colleagues from all sides of the House. We've invested in our programme expertise and brought more senior-level oversight through a streamlined cross-Whitehall governance board in London. We've appointed new programme teams in each Gulf state, with the ambassador or head of mission held accountable for the effective programme delivery and value for money. And I can confirm that we will publish a summary of work funded by the Gulf Strategy 2021 for members of this House and broader society to scrutinise. Please be assured that I and my colleagues in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office will continue to monitor the governance and operation of the Gulf Strategy Fund, as it now is, so that it delivers true value for money, viable results, supporting the UK's explicit desire to be a force for good, not only in the region, but in the world. Thank you, sir.
To wind up, David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr Robertson, and can I say it's a pleasure to see you in the chair since we started the debate. I'm very grateful to colleagues from a number of parties, and this is the first point I want to make in winding up, is that normally a Westminster Hall debate a Thursday afternoon would tend to be one man and a dog. Unfortunately, in this case, it's several men and no dogs. But the point remains that we've had members from the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the SNP, the Democratic Unionist Party, and the Liberal Democrats. Very unusual for so many parties to come together. And as the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Caerphilly, said, to all be resonating and kind of affirming the same message to the government, and I hope that the Minister reflects on that. I think the point really was made by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Orkney and Shetland, that several times in the course of his remarks, the Minister, who, as I say, I have the utmost respect for, was able to reference countries such as Oman, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, on a country-by-country basis where funding is becoming available. And I'm afraid that rather flies in the face of the argument that's been made to honourable members of this House when lodging written questions that information can't be provided on a country-by-country basis, as the Minister has just done in his summing up. I welcome what he said about publishing a summary of 2021 financial year spending, but I guess it comes back to that central point. We're not just looking for a summary here, we're looking for all of the information. And if the government doesn't have anything to fear, then they won't have any difficulty publishing that information. And I think probably the final thing that I want to say is I've observed in 19 years of being involved in politics, 3 years in this House, that Conservative members more often than not demand to know about every single penny being spent in terms of international development. And a number of us in this House have had concerns about the merger of the Department of International Development and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Now, I accept that has gone ahead, but the government can't have its cake and eat it here. If it's going to want to have that level of transparency of international development funding, then surely it has to be the same when it comes to the IAF as well. And so I hope that the Minister would accept that this is not something that's going to go away, and I would invite him on behalf of my honourable friend Member for Argyll and Bute to come along to the all-party group on human rights in the Gulf to perhaps continue this conversation. The Minister, as he knows, is someone who I consider a friend. I'm sure that he will be more than happy to continue this conversation and seek to allay the fears of honourable members of this House.
The question is that this House has considered transparency of the Integrated Activity Fund.